"Grandma, Mom set you up, don't sign." My 8-year-old grandson, Lucas, whispered those 6 words so quietly that for a moment I thought I had imagined them. But the way his small hands gripped my sweater told me he meant every word. Across the living room, my daughter-in-law Emily stood there smiling, holding a folder filled with documents she wanted me to sign. My son Michael hovered behind her, strangely silent. For 67 years, I had believed my family was the safest place in the world. In that moment, I realized it might be the most dangerous. And the only person trying to protect me was a child. Before I tell you what happened next, let me ask you something. If you were in my place, would you trust your family or your gut? If this story touches, you take a second to like the video. And if you enjoy emotional family stories like this, consider subscribing to the channel. I'm also curious, where are you watching from and what time is it there right now? Tell me in the comments. I read as many as I can. Now, let me take you back to the beginning. My name is Donna Wilson, and until a few months ago, I believed I had lived a fairly ordinary life. The kind of life that doesn't make headlines, doesn't involve dramatic betrayals or hidden plots. Just quiet days, familiar routines, and a family I trusted with my whole heart. I'm 67 years old, and I live in Columbus, Ohio, in the same house my late husband Robert and I bought nearly 40 years ago. Back then, the neighborhood was still new. Fresh sidewalks, young trees planted along the streets, and couples like us who were just starting their lives together. Robert used to joke that we bought the smallest house on the block, but filled it with the biggest memories. He was right. This house saw everything. Birthday parties with balloons tied to the mailbox, Christmas mornings with wrapping paper covering the living room floor, late nights when Michael, our son, sat at the kitchen table doing homework while Robert tried to teach him algebra, and somehow made it more confusing than the textbook ever could. Robert had a laugh that could fill an entire room, deep and warm like a fireplace in the middle of winter. Even now, 7 years after cancer took him from me, I sometimes still hear it echo in the quiet corners of this house. When Robert passed away, people assumed I would sell the house, downsize, move into one of those tidy retirement communities where everything looks the same and the lawns are trimmed with military precision. But I couldn't do it. This house wasn't just a building, it was my life. Every scratch on the wooden floor, every fading photo on the hallway wall, every creaky step on the staircase, it all belonged to us. So I stayed. And for a while, things were good. Michael lived about 20 minutes away with his wife Emily and their son Lucas. Michael worked as an IT specialist for a healthcare company. He had always been a quiet boy, growing up gentle, thoughtful, sometimes a little too eager to keep the peace. Emily, on the other hand, was the opposite. Confident, organized, charming in that polished way that made people trust her almost immediately. When Michael first introduced her to me 12 years ago, I remember thinking how lucky he was. She shook my hand firmly, looked me straight in the eye, and said, "I've heard so much about you, Mrs. Wilson." I told her to call me Donna. She smiled and said, "Only if you promise to call me your daughter-in-law." At the time, it felt sweet, maybe even sincere. Over the years, Emily built a career in insurance sales. She was good at it, very good. The kind of person who could walk into a room full of strangers and leave with 3 new clients and everyone's phone number. Michael often said she had a gift for reading people. Looking back now, I realize he was more right than he knew. When Lucas was born 8 years ago, everything changed in the best possible way. Becoming a grandmother filled a space in my heart I didn't even know existed. Lucas had the same soft brown eyes Michael had as a child and the same habit of asking questions that no adult could answer easily. "Grandma," he once asked me when he was 5, "why do grown-ups always say they're fine when they're not?" I remember laughing then. Now I think about that question a lot, because Lucas notices things, always has. He notices when someone's voice sounds different, when a smile doesn't quite reach someone's eyes, when adults think they're being subtle, but really aren't. When Michael lost his job during the pandemic a few years ago, things were tough for them for a while. I helped where I could. I watched Lucas during the week so Emily could keep working. I paid for a few things they didn't ask for, but clearly needed Lucas's school supplies, groceries, now and then a small loan to help cover the rent during those uncertain months. Family helps family. That's how Robert and I raised Michael. Eventually, Michael found a new job and things stabilized again. They moved into a nicer apartment, Lucas started elementary school, and life settled back into its comfortable rhythm. But about 6 months ago, something began to change. At first it was subtle. Emily started visiting more often. Sometimes she would stop by during the afternoon while Lucas was at school. Other times she'd bring dinner unexpectedly and insist we eat together. On the surface, it seemed thoughtful. "Just checking on you," she'd say brightly. "You shouldn't be alone so much, Donna." I appreciated the concern at first. After all, I do live alone. And at my age, people worry about things like that. But then the questions started. Small ones, carefully worded ones. "Have you been remembering to take your vitamins? Do you ever forget where you put things? Have you noticed your memory slipping at all?" The first time she asked something like that, I laughed. "Emily, I'm 67, not 97. She smiled politely, but she didn't laugh with me. Instead, she said, "It's just something families should pay attention to." After that, the topic came up more often. Too often. Once during dinner at their apartment, Emily casually said to Michael, "Donna forgot what day Lucas's soccer practice was last week." I blinked in surprise. "That's not true," I said. "I thought practice was Wednesday, not Thursday. That's not forgetting, it's mixing up a schedule." Emily shrugged lightly as if the distinction didn't matter. "Well, little things can add up." Michael didn't argue. He just nodded slowly and said we should keep an eye on that. Something about that moment unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. It wasn't what they said. It was how easily the idea slipped into the conversation, like a seed being planted. Then there were the vitamins. One afternoon, Emily arrived with a bright orange bottle. "These are great for cognitive support," she explained. "Omega blend. Really good for memory." "I already take vitamins," I told her. "These are better," she insisted. So I thanked her and placed the bottle on the kitchen counter. Later that night, I noticed something strange. The label had been partially peeled back and reattached. At the time, I told myself I was being paranoid. Still, I didn't take them. Not because I suspected anything truly sinister, but because something deep inside me, some quiet instinct, was beginning to whisper that things weren't quite right. A few weeks later, Emily brought up something else. We were sitting in my living room after dinner when she said casually, "Have you ever thought about senior living communities?" I raised an eyebrow. "You mean retirement homes?" "They're not like they used to be," she said quickly. "Some of them are beautiful. Full medical staff, activities, social life." "I have a social life," I replied. "Well, yes, but eventually." She let the sentence trail off. Michael stared at the carpet. Lucas, who had been building a Lego spaceship on the floor, suddenly stopped and looked up at us. No one spoke for a few seconds. Then Emily smiled again, one of those perfectly controlled smiles she had mastered over the years. "We're just thinking about the future," she said. I nodded slowly, but something in my chest tightened, because for the first time I had the strange feeling that the future Emily was imagining might not include me living in my own home. At the time, I pushed the thought away. I told myself families talk about these things all the time. I told myself Emily was probably just trying to be responsible. I told myself not to read too much into it. But looking back now, I see it clearly. That was the moment the story truly began, and the moment the quiet seeds of doubt were planted in my mind, seeds that would soon grow into something much darker than I ever could have imagined. At the time, I tried to convince myself I was overthinking everything. After all, families worry about each other. That's normal. And Emily had always been the practical one in the family, the one who planned things ahead, who thought about risks before they became problems. But the strange feeling in my chest didn't go away. In fact, over the next few weeks, it grew. It started with small moments, little comments that might have meant nothing if they had happened once or twice, but they kept happening. One afternoon, Emily stopped by with Lucas after school. We were sitting in the kitchen while Lucas worked on a drawing at the table. Emily had made tea for both of us. I remember telling her about a neighbor who had recently moved away. "The Johnsons finally sold their house," I said. Emily tilted her head. "You mean the house with the blue shutters?" "Yes," I replied. "I thought those shutters were gray," she said, lightly. "They were blue," I insisted. She looked at Michael, who had just walked in the door. "See," she said with a small laugh. "Donna mixes things up sometimes." Michael chuckled awkwardly. I felt something tighten in my stomach. "They were blue," I repeated more quietly this time. Lucas looked up from his drawing. "They're blue," he said matter-of-factly. For a moment, no one spoke. Emily smiled again, one of those calm, smooth smiles. Well, she said maybe they faded. The conversation moved on, but I noticed something that bothered me deeply. Emily had turned a simple disagreement about shutters into something else, something about my memory, and Michael hadn't corrected her. Not at once. That same pattern repeated itself again and again. Another evening, when they came for dinner, I mentioned that my doctor had recommended walking more. Emily tilted her head sympathetically. Donna, didn't he also say you should be careful about driving at night? I frowned. No, he didn't say that. Oh, she said softly. Maybe I misunderstood. Michael glanced between us. Well, you do sometimes get tired in the evenings. I've driven at night for 40 years, I replied. Emily raised her hands slightly as if surrendering. I'm just concerned about your safety. Those words. Concern. Safety. They appeared in almost every conversation now. At first I told myself Emily was simply being protective. But the way she said those things always in front of Michael, always framed as gentle worry, began to feel less like care and more like a quiet narrative forming around me, a story I hadn't agreed to be part of. Then there were the vitamins. Emily kept bringing them. Each time a different bottle. Memory supplements, brain support formulas, herbal blends. Just try these, she would say. They help a lot of people. I thanked her politely and placed them in the cabinet above the stove. One day, Lucas noticed. Grandma, why do you have so many vitamin bottles? I laughed. Your mom likes to make sure I stay healthy. Lucas stared at the cabinet thoughtfully. She gives those to you a lot. Yes, she does. He nodded slowly, but something about his expression made me uneasy. It was the same thoughtful look he got when he was trying to solve a puzzle. Around that time, Emily began bringing up another topic more often. Senior living communities. The first time she had mentioned them casually. Now she talked about them as if they were inevitable. One evening during dinner, she pulled out her phone and showed me pictures. Look at this place, she said, turning the screen toward me. The photos showed bright apartments, landscaped gardens, smiling elderly people playing cards in a sunlit lounge. Full medical staff, she explained. Transportation services, social activities every day. It looks expensive, I said. Well, she replied, sometimes selling a large house can make that transition easier. I felt my fork pause halfway to my mouth. Selling a large house. Michael cleared his throat. It's just something to think about, Mom. I looked at him carefully. Are you worried about me living here alone? He shifted in his chair. No, not really. It's just planning ahead. Planning ahead. That phrase again. Lucas sat quietly beside me, pushing peas around his plate. After dinner, when Emily went into the kitchen to help Michael with dishes, Lucas followed me into the living room. Grandma, he said softly. Yes. Are you moving away? The question caught me off guard. No, I said quickly. Why would you think that? He shrugged. Mom talks about it a lot. I felt my heart sink slightly. What does she say? Lucas hesitated. Just that it might be better. Better for who I asked gently. He didn't answer. Instead, he climbed onto the couch beside me and leaned against my shoulder. Sometimes children say more in silence than adults do with words. Over the next couple of weeks, things became even stranger. Emily started correcting me in front of other people. One Sunday, my neighbor Carol stopped by while Emily and Michael were visiting. Carol asked me if I had watched a particular show the night before. Yes, I said. The episode where the detective finally finds the missing girl. Emily shook her head slightly. No, Donna, that happened 2 episodes ago. I frowned. No, it didn't. Emily laughed lightly. See, she forgets things like this sometimes. Carol looked uncomfortable. I'm sure it's nothing she said, but the damage had already been done. The idea had been spoken out loud. Again. Later that night, after everyone left, I sat alone in my living room thinking about everything that had happened. A strange realization slowly formed in my mind. It wasn't just the comments themselves, it was the pattern. Emily rarely said these things when we were alone. She said them in front of others, in front of Michael, in front of neighbors, in front of anyone who might later remember them. Little moments, little proofs, almost like she was collecting them. The thought unsettled me deeply, but I still didn't want to believe it meant anything sinister. After all, this was my family, the people I trusted most in the world. Still, a quiet voice inside my mind kept whispering the same question. Why did Emily keep emphasizing these little memory issues? Why did she keep bringing up senior living? Why did Michael seem increasingly hesitant to contradict her? And why did Lucas watch everything so carefully like a child who had noticed something the adults hadn't? I didn't have answers yet, not real ones. But one thing was becoming painfully clear. The story Emily was telling about me, about my memory, my independence, my future was slowly taking shape. And the most frightening part was that I hadn't even realized it was happening until it was already underway. About 2 weeks after the dinner where Emily showed me those pictures of senior living communities, she came to my house again on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. I remember the day clearly because it had been raining since morning. The sky over Columbus was that dull gray color that makes everything feel slower and heavier. I was in the kitchen making soup when I heard the front door open. "Donna," Emily called out. "I'm in the kitchen," I replied. She walked in with her usual confident stride, carrying a slim black folder tucked under her arm. Her hair was perfectly styled, and she wore the same polite smile she always did when she visited. But something about the way she held that folder made my stomach tighten. "Hi," she said, warmly, leaning over to give me a quick hug. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," I said, stirring the pot. "I just started making lunch." "Smells great," she said. Lucas followed behind her, holding his backpack, even though it was still early in the afternoon. "Lucas, why aren't you at school?" I asked. "Early dismissal today," Emily answered quickly. "Teacher training." Lucas didn't say anything. He just walked quietly into the living room and sat down on the couch. Emily placed the black folder on the kitchen table. "That's actually part of why I came," she said. I turned off the stove and sat down across from her. "What's going on?" She slid the folder toward me and opened it carefully. Inside were several neatly printed documents clipped together. "Nothing serious," she said with an easy smile. "Just some paperwork we should probably take care of." I glanced at the pages. Legal language. Signatures at the bottom. My name typed neatly in several places. "What kind of paperwork?" I asked. Emily folded her hands calmly. "It's just a medical power of attorney." I looked up. "For what?" "Well," she said gently, "in case of emergencies. If you ever needed help making medical decisions, someone should be authorized to step in." I had heard of those documents before. They weren't unusual, but something about the situation still felt wrong. "I'm perfectly capable of making my own medical decisions," I said. "Of course you are," Emily replied quickly. "This isn't about that, it's just a precaution." She pointed to one of the pages. It would simply allow Michael and me to help if anything unexpected happened. I flipped through the documents slowly. There were several pages, more than I expected. Lucas had wandered into the kitchen now, standing quietly near the doorway. I could feel his eyes on me. Emily kept talking. "You know how hospitals can be," she said. "They won't talk to family members without the right paperwork." "That makes sense," I admitted. Michael wasn't there, which struck me as odd. Usually when something involved both of them, he came along. "Why didn't Michael come today?" I asked. Emily shrugged lightly. "He's working late, but we already talked about it." Already talked about it. That phrase lingered in the air. I glanced down at the documents again. The legal wording was dense. Too dense to read properly in a few seconds. "I should probably take time to go through this," I said. Emily nodded quickly. "Of course." But something in her eyes flickered. Impatience. Just for a moment. "Most people sign these right away," she added. "They're very standard." Lucas suddenly stepped closer to me. "Grandma," he said quietly. Emily looked at him. "What is it, Lucas? Can I talk to Grandma for a second?" Emily smiled. "Sure, honey." Lucas reached for my hand. "Just for a minute." I stood up and let him lead me a few steps away from the table toward the hallway where Emily couldn't hear us clearly. Lucas looked nervous. His small fingers tightened around mine. "Grandma," he whispered. "Yes." His voice dropped even lower. "Mom set you up." For a moment, I didn't understand what he meant. "What do you mean?" Lucas swallowed. "Don't sign." The words were barely audible, but they hit me like a sudden gust of icy wind. "Lucas," I said softly, kneeling so I could look him in the eyes. "Why would you say that?" He glanced toward the kitchen where Emily sat. "I heard her talking," he whispered. "Talking to who?" He shook his head. "I don't know. On the phone." My heart began beating faster. "What did she say?" Lucas hesitated. Then he repeated the words slowly as if he had memorized them. "She said, once you sign, everything will be easier. Everything will be easier." The phrase echoed inside my mind. "What else did she say?" I asked gently. Lucas looked scared now. "I don't remember." That was enough. I stood up slowly, trying to keep my face calm. Emily looked up as we walked back into the kitchen. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Yes," I said, forcing a small smile. Lucas quietly sat down at the table. Emily pushed the documents toward me again. "Where were we?" I picked up the first page. The signature line waited at the bottom. For a moment, the room felt strangely quiet. Lucas stared at me. Emily watched me carefully. I could feel the weight of Lucas's whisper pressing against my thoughts. "Mom set you up. Don't sign." I looked down at the document again. Then I slowly set the pen back on the table. You know what I said. My eyes have been a little tired lately. Emily blinked. I think I'd rather read through all of this tonight, I continued, just to make sure I understand everything. Her smile faltered for a split second. Then it returned. Of course, she said smoothly. That's perfectly fine. But the brief flicker of disappointment in her expression didn't escape me. She hadn't expected hesitation. She had expected compliance. I'll leave the folder here, she said, standing up. No rush. Lucas looked visibly relieved. Emily gathered her purse. We should get going anyway, she added. Lucas has homework. They left a few minutes later. The house fell silent again. The rain outside had grown heavier, tapping softly against the windows. I carried the folder into the living room and sat down on the couch. For several minutes, I simply stared at the documents without opening them. My hands felt slightly cold. Lucas's words kept replaying in my mind. Mom set you up. Don't sign. Finally, I opened the folder and began reading carefully. The first page was exactly what Emily had said, a medical power of attorney. But the second page was different. Then the third. And the fourth. By the time I reached the last page, my stomach had dropped so low it felt like it had disappeared entirely, because hidden inside those pages were clauses that went far beyond medical decisions. There were sections about financial authority, sections about asset management, sections about housing decisions if I was deemed unable to live independently. And the person listed to control all of it was Emily, not Michael, Emily. I slowly closed the folder. The quiet voice in the back of my mind, the one that had been whispering doubts for weeks, was no longer whispering. It was shouting. And for the first time, a terrifying thought entered my mind. What if Lucas was right? For a long time after Emily and Lucas left that afternoon, I just sat there in my living room with the folder resting on my lap. The rain outside had stopped, but the sky was still heavy and gray. The kind of quiet afternoon that normally made the house feel peaceful. That day it felt suffocating. I opened the folder again and carefully reread every page. The first document, as Emily had said, was a medical power of attorney. On its own, it wasn't unusual. Many families set something like that up as a precaution. But the other documents attached to it told a very different story. The second set of papers granted financial authority, not just temporary help, full authority. The language was written in dense legal terms, but the meaning was clear. If I signed these documents, Emily would have the legal right to manage my bank accounts, pay bills, move money, and make decisions about my property if I were considered unable to handle my finances. The third document was even more alarming. It discussed housing authority. If I were declared incapable of living independently, the appointed agent Emily would have the right to determine where I lived, which meant she could move me into a care facility, or sell my home, or both. I sat very still on the couch as that realization slowly settled in. Emily hadn't lied exactly. There was a medical power of attorney, but it was buried among documents that could effectively transfer control of my entire life. My hands trembled slightly as I closed the folder again. Lucas's words echoed in my mind. Mom set you up. Don't sign. The frightening thing was that Lucas had said those words before I had even opened the folder, which meant he must have heard something serious enough to scare him. But children often misunderstand adult conversations, I told myself. Maybe he had overheard something out of context. Maybe Emily had simply explained the paperwork poorly. Maybe there was some innocent explanation. But the more I thought about it, the less convincing those possibilities felt. Because Emily had presented the documents as simple medical paperwork, and they were anything but simple. I stood up slowly and walked into the kitchen carrying the folder with me. The afternoon sunlight had begun breaking through the clouds, casting pale light across the counter. For a moment, I stared at the orange bottle of vitamins Emily had brought weeks earlier. It was still sitting exactly where I had left it, untouched. I picked it up and turned it in my hand. The label read Cognitive Support Formula. Underneath that, smaller letters promised improved memory and mental clarity. Maybe it was perfectly harmless. But suddenly I didn't trust anything Emily had given me. I set the bottle down again and returned to the living room. If there was one thing Robert had taught me during our 40 years together, it was this. When something doesn't feel right, you don't ignore it. You investigate it. I needed someone who understood legal documents, someone who could look at these papers objectively, someone who wasn't emotionally involved. The first person who came to mind was my friend Karen Mitchell. Karen and I had known each other for nearly 25 years. Our husbands had worked together at the same manufacturing company before Robert retired. Over time, Karen and I became close friends. After her husband passed away, Karen went back to work as a legal assistant at a small law firm downtown. She had spent years helping attorneys prepare contracts and estate documents. If anyone could help me understand what these papers really meant, it was Karen. I picked up the phone and dialed her number. She answered on the third ring. Donna. I was just thinking about you this morning. Hi, Karen, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Everything okay? I hesitated. I'm not sure. There was a pause on the other end of the line. What's going on? I have some paperwork I'd like you to look at. Legal paperwork. Yes. Karen didn't ask many questions. Bring it over, she said. I'm home. Karen lived about 15 minutes away in a small brick house near a park. When I arrived, she was already waiting on the porch with 2 mugs of coffee. You look worried, she said as I walked up the steps. I might be imagining things, I replied. Let's find out. We sat at her kitchen table. I slid the black folder across to her. These came from Emily today, I explained. Karen adjusted her reading glasses and began examining the documents. For the first few minutes, she didn't say anything. Her eyes moved slowly across the pages. Occasionally, she would flip back to reread a section. The longer she read, the more serious her expression became. Finally, she leaned back in her chair and looked at me. Donna, she said quietly, did Emily tell you what these are? She said it was just a medical power of attorney. Karen exhaled slowly. Well, technically there is one in here. But these documents go much further than that. I felt my stomach tighten again. How much further? Karen tapped the pages with her finger. If you sign these, you're giving Emily extremely broad authority. Over what? Over almost everything. She flipped to one of the middle pages. This clause would allow her to manage your finances if a doctor declared you incapable. That sounds reasonable, I said carefully. Karen shook her head slightly. It might be reasonable if it were limited, but this isn't. She pointed to another paragraph. Look at this section. I leaned forward. The language was complicated, but Karen summarized it clearly. If Emily and Michael claimed you were no longer capable of managing your affairs, they could petition for guardianship. My heart skipped. What does that mean exactly? Karen's voice became very calm. It means a court could assign someone to make decisions for you. Decisions like where you live, how your money is used, what happens to your property. The room suddenly felt smaller, and the person requesting that guardianship, Karen continued gently, would most likely be Emily. I stared at the documents again. That would mean, Karen finished the sentence for me, it would mean she could legally control your life. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The kitchen clock ticked quietly on the wall. Finally, I said the question that had been building inside my chest. Do people actually do this? Karen's expression softened. Unfortunately, yes. Why? Money, she said simply. I swallowed. My house? Karen nodded slowly. Your house, your savings, anything valuable. I thought about the photographs hanging in my hallway at home. Robert holding baby Michael. Michael's high school graduation. Lucas smiling with missing front teeth. Memories. 40 years of them. And suddenly, I imagined strangers walking through the house after it had been sold, opening closets, measuring walls, talking about renovations. The thought made my chest ache. Karen reached across the table and touched my hand. Donna, she said carefully, there's something else you should know. What? These documents don't prove Emily is planning something malicious. I nodded slowly. But they also don't prove she isn't. Lucas's whisper returned to my mind again. Mom set you up. Don't sign. I looked at Karen. What would you do if you were me? Karen didn't hesitate. I would not sign anything. I exhaled slowly. And I would talk to a lawyer, she added. Why? Because if someone is preparing documents like this, there may already be other steps happening behind the scenes. The words sent a chill through me. What kind of steps? Karen closed the folder. The kind that make it easier to claim you can't take care of yourself. For the first time since Emily had walked into my house that afternoon, a terrible possibility began to form clearly in my mind. What if those strange comments about my memory, those little corrections in front of other people, those conversations about senior living, weren't random at all? What if they were preparation? Preparation for something much bigger. Karen's words stayed with me the entire drive home. If someone is preparing documents like this, she had said carefully, there may already be other steps happening behind the scenes. At the time, I wanted to dismiss that idea as overly cautious. Karen had spent years working in law offices. Maybe she had simply seen too many worst-case scenarios. But as I pulled into my driveway and looked at my house, the house Robert and I had spent 4 decades building a life in, I couldn't shake the feeling that something serious was unfolding around me, something I hadn't fully seen until now. I walked inside slowly. The late afternoon sun had finally broken through the clouds, casting warm light across the living room. Everything looked exactly the same as it had that morning. The same couch, the same photographs, the same quiet comfort. But my perspective had shifted. I placed the black folder on the coffee table and sat down, trying to gather my thoughts. Karen had suggested speaking to a lawyer. At first, the idea made me uncomfortable. Taking legal action against your own family, even just preparing for the possibility, felt wrong somehow. But another thought followed quickly behind that hesitation. If Emily truly had no harmful intention, speaking to a lawyer wouldn't hurt anything. And if Karen was right, then I needed to protect myself. Robert used to say something whenever we faced difficult decisions. Hope for the best, he would say, but prepare for the worst. I stood up and walked to the hallway closet where we kept an old wooden box filled with paperwork, insurance policies, tax documents, property records. Inside the box was Robert's address book. Even after smartphones replaced most phone numbers, I had kept the little leather-bound book. Robert had written dozens of names in his careful handwriting over the years. Friends, co-workers, professionals we trusted. I flipped through the pages slowly. Near the middle of the book, I found a name I remembered. David Carter, attorney. Robert had hired David about 15 years earlier when we updated our wills. I hadn't spoken to him since Robert passed away, but I still remembered the impression he made. Calm, patient, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke. I dialed the number written beside his name. To my surprise, the office answered immediately. Carter and Associates. Hello, I said. My name is Donna Wilson. I'm not sure if Mr. Carter would remember me. My husband Robert and I worked with him years ago on estate documents. One moment, please. After a brief pause, another voice came on the line. Mrs. Wilson. The voice sounded older but familiar. Yes, I said. Mr. Carter. David, please, he replied warmly. Of course I remember you and Robert. How have you been? There was genuine kindness in his voice, and for a moment my throat tightened unexpectedly. I've been managing, I said softly. I'm glad to hear it. What can I help you with? I hesitated for a second before answering. I have some documents I'd like a professional opinion on. Estate planning documents. I believe so, I said carefully. He paused for a moment. Well, that's something we can certainly look at. Would you like to come by the office? Yes, I said, that would be helpful. We scheduled an appointment for the following morning. After hanging up, I sat quietly at the kitchen table for several minutes. Something about making that phone call had shifted my mindset. Until now, everything had been confusion and suspicion. Now there was a plan. The next morning, I arrived at David Carter's office downtown. The building looked exactly as I remembered, brick exterior, brass nameplate beside the door. Inside, the receptionist greeted me and led me to a small conference room. David Carter entered a few minutes later. He was older than when I had last seen him, his hair now mostly gray, but his calm presence hadn't changed. Donna, he said warmly, shaking my hand. It's good to see you again. You too, I replied. We sat down across from each other at the table. I placed the black folder in front of him. These were given to me by my daughter-in-law yesterday. David opened the folder and began reading. The room was silent except for the faint rustle of paper as he turned each page. His expression remained neutral, but I noticed his eyebrows rise slightly at certain sections. After about 10 minutes, he closed the folder and folded his hands. Well, he said thoughtfully, these are certainly comprehensive. That's one word for it, I said. He gave a small, sympathetic smile. Tell me exactly how these documents were presented to you. So I did. I explained how Emily described them as simple medical paperwork. I explained Lucas's warning. I explained Karen's concerns. David listened without interrupting. When I finished, he leaned back slightly in his chair. First, he said you did the right thing by not signing anything. Relief washed over me. Second, he continued, your friend Karen was correct. These documents grant extremely broad authority. How broad, I asked. If activated, they would allow your appointed agent, Emily, to control nearly every aspect of your financial life. And my living situation. Yes, he said. My chest tightened again. But here's the important thing, David added. These documents only become powerful if certain conditions are met. What kind of conditions? He opened the folder again and pointed to a paragraph. This clause states that the authority becomes active if you are deemed incapable of managing your own affairs. And who decides that? Typically a medical professional, he said. A doctor. Yes, sometimes more than one. I thought about Emily mentioning doctors recently. You mentioned earlier that your daughter-in-law has been raising concerns about your memory, David said. Yes, and she's done this in front of other people. Yes. He nodded slowly. That could be significant. How? In guardianship cases, it's common for someone to create a pattern of documented concerns. A pattern. Witness statements, medical opinions, examples of forgetfulness. My stomach sank. All the small comments she's been making, I said quietly. David didn't respond immediately. Instead, he asked another question. Has anyone suggested that you move into assisted living recently? Yes, I said. How often? Several times in the past few weeks. He nodded again. That fits a common progression. What progression? He spoke gently. First establish concern about memory or safety, then suggest alternative living arrangements, then introduce legal authority to manage those arrangements. The pieces clicked together in my mind like parts of a puzzle finally aligning. Emily's questions about my memory, her corrections in front of others, the conversations about senior living, the paperwork. It hadn't been random. It had been building. I need to ask you something important, David said carefully. Of course. Do you believe your daughter-in-law is acting with malicious intent? The question hung in the air. I wanted to say no. I wanted to believe there was some misunderstanding. But Lucas's voice echoed in my mind again. Mom set you up. Don't sign. I don't know, I admitted quietly. David nodded. That's a fair answer. What should I do now? He leaned forward slightly. For the moment, do nothing. Nothing. Don't confront anyone. Don't sign anything. Don't change your routine. Why? Because if there is a plan unfolding, the best thing we can do is observe it. Observe it. Yes, he said calmly. Let them believe you're unaware. A chill ran through me. You think they're planning something bigger? David didn't answer directly, but his next words told me everything. If someone is attempting to build a guardianship case, he said quietly, they will eventually take steps that leave evidence. And when they do, his expression hardened slightly, then we will be ready. For the first time since Lucas whispered those 6 words to me in my hallway, I realized something important. I was no longer just reacting. Now I was preparing. And whatever Emily thought she was doing behind the scenes, she had no idea that I was starting to see the whole picture. After my meeting with David Carter, I drove home with a strange mixture of emotions swirling inside me. Fear was still there, of course. It sat heavy in my chest like a stone I couldn't quite move, but alongside it was something new, something steadier, awareness. For weeks, maybe months, I had been walking through conversations with Emily without understanding what was really happening. Now I did. Now every word she had said carried a different weight. David had told me to do something that felt both simple and incredibly difficult. Act normal, he said. Don't confront anyone. Don't reveal what you know. Let things unfold. So that's exactly what I did. Over the next several days, I went about my routine as if nothing had changed. I watered the plants in the backyard. I walked around the neighborhood in the mornings. I visited the grocery store and chatted with Mrs. Halpern from 2 houses down, just like I always did. But inside, I was watching everything much more carefully. 3 days after my meeting with David, Emily called. Hi, Donna, she said brightly. Her voice sounded exactly the same as always, warm, friendly, perfectly controlled. Hi, Emily. I just wanted to check in about the paperwork I left with you. There it was. The question I had been expecting. I've been meaning to read through it carefully, I replied calmly. Well, if you have any questions, Michael and I would be happy to explain. Thank you, I said. I appreciate that. There was a small pause. Then Emily asked casually, How have you been feeling lately? Feeling? Yes. Your memory, your energy levels, things like that. I almost smiled. 2 weeks ago, I might have answered that question honestly. Now I recognized it immediately for what it was. Information gathering. I feel fine, I said. That's good, she replied, though something in her tone suggested the answer wasn't the one she had hoped for. Well, just let us know when you're ready to sign those documents. Of course, I said. After the call ended, I sat quietly at my kitchen table for a moment. David had been right. Emily wasn't rushing me. She was waiting, probably assuming that eventually I would sign, that I would trust her, that I would follow the role she had carefully built for me. The slightly forgetful, elderly woman who needed help managing things. The next real clue came from Lucas. It happened the following Saturday. Michael dropped him off around noon so he could spend the afternoon with me. That wasn't unusual. Lucas and I often had little weekend visits, but that day he seemed quieter than usual. We were sitting at the kitchen table coloring together, Lucas working on a picture of a spaceship, me pretending to help while mostly watching him. He kept glancing toward the window. "Everything okay?" I asked. He nodded quickly. "Yeah." But his voice didn't sound convincing. A few minutes later, he leaned closer to me and lowered his voice. "Grandma." "Yes." "Did you sign those papers?" My heart skipped. "No," I said gently. Lucas visibly relaxed. "Good." I studied his face carefully. "Lucas, can I ask you something?" He nodded. "When you told me not to sign, what exactly did you hear your mom say?" Lucas hesitated. His crayon paused mid-stroke on the paper. "I wasn't supposed to hear," he said quietly. "That's okay," I replied softly. "I was in the hallway." He continued. "Mom was on the phone in the kitchen. Who was she talking to?" "I don't know." "What did she say?" Lucas stared down at the table for a moment, clearly trying to remember. "She said something about a doctor." My chest tightened. "What about a doctor?" "She said if the doctor agrees, then everything will be easier." That phrase again. "Everything will be easier." "What else did she say?" I asked carefully. Lucas shrugged. "She said Dad doesn't like the idea, but he'll go along with it." "Michael!" My stomach twisted. "Did she say what it was?" I asked. Lucas shook his head. "No." For a moment, the only sound in the room was the quiet scratching of Lucas's crayon. Then he added something else. "But she sounded different." "Different how?" "Like when she's mad." That detail sent a small chill down my spine. Emily rarely showed anger in front of others. She was too controlled for that. Which meant whatever conversation Lucas overheard had been private enough for her to drop that polished mask. "Lucas," I said gently, "why did you tell me about it?" He looked up at me, surprised by the question. "Because you're my grandma." The simplicity of his answer nearly broke my heart. Adults complicate loyalty. Children don't. "Did your mom know you hurt her?" I asked. "No." "Did you tell anyone else?" He shook his head again. "Just you." I reached over and squeezed his hand. "You did the right thing," I told him. Lucas smiled slightly and went back to coloring. But inside my mind, pieces were moving quickly. Emily had mentioned a doctor. David had told me that a doctor's opinion could trigger the authority in those documents. And Lucas had overheard Emily saying Michael didn't like the idea but would go along with it, which meant Michael might know more about this plan than I had hoped. Later that afternoon, when Michael came to pick Lucas up, I watched him carefully. He stood in my living room looking slightly tired from work. "Hey, Mom," he said. "Hi, sweetheart." We chatted about ordinary things for a few minutes. Lucas's school project, Michael's job, the weather. But I noticed something subtle. Michael kept glancing at the black folder sitting on the coffee table. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Did you get a chance to look at those documents Emily brought over?" There it was. "Yes," I said. And I forced myself to keep my voice calm. "They're complicated." Michael nodded slowly. "Well, they're just meant to help." "I understand," I said. Another silence fell between us. Then Michael said something that surprised me. "Emily worries about you." I met his eyes. "Do you?" He hesitated. "I just want to make sure everything is taken care of." Taken care of. The phrase sounded eerily similar to Emily's words. I realized then that Michael might not fully understand what Emily was doing, but he was still part of the conversation, still part of the plan. Lucas ran into the room with his backpack. "Ready to go?" Michael asked. Lucas nodded. Before leaving, he gave me a quick hug. "Bye, Grandma." "Bye, sweetheart." As they walked toward the door, I noticed something else. Lucas looked back at me once, just for a second. But the expression on his face wasn't the carefree smile of a child leaving his grandmother's house. It was the worried look of someone who knew something wasn't right. After they left, I sat alone in my living room again. David's advice echoed in my mind. Let them believe you're unaware. Let them continue. Because the more they continued, the more evidence they would leave behind. And if Emily truly was building a case against me, then sooner or later she would make her next move. The more days passed, the more I realized something strange about the situation. Emily wasn't rushing. At first, I thought that meant she was uncertain about her plan. But the longer I observed her behavior, the clearer it became that patience was actually part of her strategy. She believed time was on her side. If the story she had been quietly building about my declining memory continued long enough, eventually, it would sound believable even to people who cared about me. That realization unsettled me more than anything else, because it meant Emily wasn't acting impulsively. She was planning, carefully. A week after my conversation with Lucas, I met David Carter again. This time I brought something with me, a notebook. During the previous days, I had started writing down everything I could remember, every comment Emily made about my memory, every conversation where she suggested assisted living, every moment when she corrected me in front of someone else. At first it felt strange to document those things, but David had encouraged it. Patterns matter, he told me during our last meeting. If someone was preparing a guardianship claim, patterns of behavior could become evidence in court. When I handed him the notebook, he read through several pages silently. "This is very helpful," he said finally. "You really think this could become a legal case?" I asked. "It's possible," he replied. "Emily hasn't actually done anything illegal yet, has she?" "Not yet." The way he said those two words made my stomach tighten. "But the situation does suggest something important," he continued. "What?" "Your daughter-in-law may have a strong financial motive." That was something Karen had mentioned as well. But until that moment, I hadn't really explored it. "What kind of motive?" I asked. David folded his hands. "The most common one is debt." The word landed heavily in the quiet office. "Debt," I repeated. "Yes." He leaned slightly forward. "In many cases where someone attempts to gain control of an elderly relative's finances, there are serious financial pressures involved." I thought about Emily's job. She had always appeared successful, well-dressed, confident, organized. But appearances can be misleading. "How would we find out if that's the case?" I asked. David gave a small smile. "Sometimes information reveals itself." "What does that mean?" "It means people leave trails." A few days later, that trail began to appear. It started with a phone call from Karen. "Donna, she said I ran into someone interesting today." "Who?" "An old coworker of mine. She works at a regional credit office." I wasn't sure where the conversation was going, and I asked. Karen hesitated. "Well, Emily's name came up." My heart skipped slightly. "In what context?" "Debt collection." The word hung in the air. "What kind of debt?" I asked quietly. "Credit cards, mostly," Karen replied. "How much?" "I don't know exact numbers," she said, "but enough that her account has been flagged for follow-up." I sat down slowly at my kitchen table. Emily had never mentioned financial trouble. In fact, she often spoke as if everything in their life was perfectly stable. "She may be trying to consolidate things," Karen continued carefully. "Or she may be looking for a larger asset to solve the problem." "A larger asset?" "Like a house." After hanging up, I walked slowly through my home, past the living room, past the staircase, into the hallway lined with family photos. The house had appreciated significantly over the years. Property values in Columbus had risen steadily, especially in my neighborhood. I remembered a real estate agent knocking on my door last spring. He had asked if I had ever considered selling. I told him no. He had looked surprised. "Properties on this street are extremely valuable right now," he said. At the time, I hadn't thought much about it. Now I did. If Emily were drowning in debt, and if she gained legal control over my finances, and if I were suddenly declared incapable of living independently, then selling my house could solve a lot of problems for her. The thought made my chest tighten painfully, because it meant the house Robert and I had spent decades building our life in might be nothing more than a financial solution in Emily's eyes. 2 evenings later, another piece of information arrived. This time it came from Lucas. Michael dropped him off for another short visit while he ran errands. Lucas sat at the kitchen table eating cookies while I made tea. "Grandma," he said suddenly. "Yes. Mom has been talking about houses a lot." "Houses?" "Yeah." He shrugged. "Like how much they cost?" My hands paused on the teapot. "What kind of houses?" "I don't know, just houses." "Did she say why?" Lucas shook his head. "But she said something about yours." My heart thumped once in my chest. "What did she say?" Lucas thought for a moment. "She said it's worth a lot now." I felt a cold wave of realization wash through me. Lucas continued speaking, unaware of the significance of his words. "She was talking to someone on the phone again." "Did you hear who?" "No." "What else did she say?" He frowned slightly, trying to remember. "She said once everything is settled, things will be easier." That phrase again. "Everything will be easier." Lucas bit into his cookie. "Why does Mom want to talk about your house so much?" I forced myself to smile. "Sometimes grown-ups worry about money," I said. Lucas nodded, apparently satisfied with the answer. But inside my mind, the pieces were connecting faster and faster. Debt, property value, legal authority, guardianship, selling the house. Emily's plan, if it was truly a plan, was starting to become clearer. But one question still troubled me more than any other. Michael. Was he fully aware of what Emily was doing? Or was he simply trusting his wife the way I had once trusted my family? That evening, after Lucas went home, I called David Carter again. I think we may have found the motive, I told him. What is it, he asked. Debt. I explained everything Karen had told me. When I finished, David was quiet for several seconds. That would certainly fit the pattern, he said finally. So what happens now, I asked. David's voice remained calm. Now we keep watching. For what? For the next step. What would that be? He didn't hesitate. If Emily is preparing to activate those documents, she will eventually need medical confirmation. The words made my stomach twist. A doctor. Yes. And when that happens, David said quietly, we will know the plan is moving forward. As I hung up the phone, a chilling realization settled over me. Emily had already mentioned doctors several times, which meant that moment might be coming sooner than I thought. By the time another week passed, I had begun to live with a strange double awareness. On the outside, everything looked completely normal. I still watered my garden every morning. I still chatted with neighbors while collecting the mail. I still met Karen for coffee at the little cafe near the park. But inside, my mind was constantly observing, watching, waiting. David Carter's advice echoed in my thoughts almost daily. Asterisk. If someone is building a guardianship case, the next step will usually involve medical evaluation. Asterisk. That possibility lingered in the back of my mind like a distant thunderstorm slowly moving closer. And then one Tuesday afternoon, Emily called. Hi, Donna, she said in her usual friendly tone. Hi, Emily. I was actually just thinking about you. I almost smiled at the irony of that. That's nice of you. I wanted to talk to you about something important, she continued. My grip on the phone tightened slightly. What is it? Well, Michael and I have been a little worried about you. There it was again. That carefully rehearsed concern. I'm doing fine, I said calmly. Yes, of course, Emily replied quickly. But we think it might be helpful if you had a checkup. A checkup? Yes, just a routine evaluation. What kind of evaluation, I asked. There was the briefest pause. A cognitive screening, she said. The words landed exactly the way David had predicted. A cognitive screening. So you think I'm losing my memory, I asked gently. Oh no, Emily said quickly. Not necessarily. It's just something doctors recommend as people get older. I already see my doctor regularly. Yes, but this specialist is very experienced with age-related concerns. Age-related concerns. The phrase sounded polished and professional, but underneath it the implication was obvious. Who suggested this doctor, I asked. Actually, Emily said a friend of mine recommended him. That answer immediately raised a red flag in my mind. A friend of hers. Not my doctor. Not someone I trusted. I appreciate the concern, I said carefully, but I don't think that's necessary. Emily didn't respond right away. Then she spoke again, her voice softer. Donna, we're just trying to make sure everything is okay. I understand. Michael worries about you too. That statement made something inside my chest tighten, because I still didn't know how much Michael truly understood. I'll think about it, I said. That's all we ask, Emily replied. When the call ended, I sat quietly at the kitchen table for several minutes. It had begun, exactly the way David predicted. That evening, I called him. She asked me to see a doctor, I told him. Did she say what kind, he asked. A cognitive screening. David exhaled slowly. That's the step we expected. So what do I do? For now, he said calmly. You agree. I blinked. You want me to go? Yes. Why? Because if the evaluation shows you are perfectly capable, which I believe it will, then it strengthens your position. That made sense. But there's another reason, he continued. What's that? If Emily recommended the doctor, we need to know whether that doctor is acting independently or whether he has already been influenced. A chill ran through me. You think she might try to manipulate the evaluation? I don't know, David said carefully. But we shouldn't rule it out. 2 days later, Emily called again. Did you think about the appointment, she asked. Yes, I said. And I'm willing to do the evaluation. Emily sounded relieved. That's great. I already spoke to the doctor's office. They can see you next week. Of course, she had already arranged it. All right, I said. I'll drive you there, she added quickly. That's not necessary, I replied. I can drive myself. Well, I thought it might be easier. I appreciate the offer, I said, but I'll manage. There was a slight hesitation in her voice. Okay, she said finally. The appointment was scheduled for the following Thursday morning. During the days leading up to it, I continued documenting everything in the notebook David had encouraged me to keep. Every conversation, every comment, every subtle suggestion about my memory. But something else began to change during that week. Michael started calling more often. At first the calls seemed casual. Just checking in, he would say. How are you feeling today? Did you remember to take your vitamins? The last question made me glance at the untouched bottles in my cabinet. I'm fine, I always replied. But one evening, during one of those calls, Michael said something that surprised me. Mom, Emily told me you seemed confused the other day. My chest tightened. Confused about what? She said you forgot where you parked your car at the grocery store. I frowned. That never happened. Michael hesitated. That's not what she told me. A quiet anger flickered inside me. She's mistaken, I said calmly. Maybe he replied uncertainly. After the call ended, I wrote the conversation down in my notebook. Another piece of the pattern. Emily wasn't just making comments in front of me. She was also shaping Michael's perception when I wasn't around. That realization hurt more than I expected, because it meant that even my own son might slowly begin to question my memory. Not because he had witnessed anything himself, but because someone he trusted was telling him it was happening. 2 days before the appointment, Lucas came over again. We sat on the back porch eating ice cream while the evening sun dipped low over the trees. Grandma, he said suddenly. Yes. Are you going to the doctor? I looked at him carefully. How did you know about that? Mom told Dad. And you heard them talking. He nodded. What did they say? Lucas thought for a moment. Mom said if the doctor says you can't live alone, then things will finally move forward. My heart skipped. Move forward? How? Lucas shrugged. I don't know, but his expression was worried again. I don't want you to move away, he added quietly. I reached over and squeezed his hand. I'm not going anywhere, I promised. But as the day of the appointment approached, I couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling growing inside me. Because somewhere in this situation, someone was expecting the doctor to say I couldn't take care of myself. And if that happened, everything Emily had been preparing for would suddenly become very real. The morning of the appointment arrived with a strange sense of quiet tension. I woke earlier than usual. The sky outside my bedroom window was pale with early light, and the neighborhood was still mostly silent. Normally, mornings like that felt peaceful to me. That day, they felt heavy. I stood in the kitchen making coffee and staring at the small notebook lying beside the sink. Over the past few weeks, it had filled with observations, dates, conversations, small details that once seemed insignificant, but now formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. Emily's comments about my memory, her suggestions about assisted living, Michael repeating her concerns, Lucas overhearing those strange phone calls, and now the doctor's appointment. If someone had told me 6 months ago that I would be documenting my own family's behavior, like evidence in a case, I would have laughed. But here I was. At 8:30, my phone rang. Emily. Good morning, Donna, she said brightly. Good morning. Are you ready for the appointment? Yes. I can still come pick you up if you want, she offered again. That's all right, I said. I'll drive myself. Well, Michael and I will meet you there then. The phrase caught my attention. Michael's coming too. Yes, she replied. We thought it would be good for him to hear the doctor's recommendations. Recommendations. The word felt carefully chosen. All right, I said calmly. The clinic was about 20 minutes away, located in a quiet medical complex on the north side of Columbus. As I drove there, I tried to keep my mind steady. David's words echoed in my thoughts. Asterisk. If the evaluation is fair, you have nothing to worry about. Still, a small knot of anxiety sat in my stomach, because this wasn't just about medical results. It was about what Emily expected those results to be. When I arrived, Emily and Michael were already standing near the entrance. Emily waved enthusiastically. Donna, over here. Michael gave me a small smile. Hi, Mom. Hi, sweetheart. Emily hugged me lightly. You look great, she said. Her tone was warm, but something about her eyes seemed anticipatory, as if she believed today would confirm something she had already decided. Inside the clinic smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee. We checked in at the front desk, and within a few minutes a nurse called my name. Mrs. Wilson. That's me. She led us down a quiet hallway. This will just take about an hour, she explained. Some memory questions, some problem-solving exercises. I nodded. Emily squeezed my arm. It's just routine, she said reassuringly. Michael stood quietly beside her. The nurse turned to them. You can wait in the lounge if you like. Emily hesitated. Are we allowed to sit in during the evaluation? The nurse shook her head politely. No, the assessment is done privately. For the first time that morning, I noticed a flicker of disappointment cross Emily's face. She covered it quickly with a smile. That makes sense. The nurse guided me into a small office. Inside sat a man in his early 60s with silver hair and thin glasses. "Mrs. Wilson," he said kindly, standing to shake my hand. "I'm Dr. Reynolds. Nice to meet you. Please have a seat." The evaluation itself was surprisingly straightforward. Dr. Reynolds asked questions about the date, the season, and where we were. He asked me to remember a short list of words and repeat them later. He gave me simple math problems. He asked me to draw a clock showing a specific time. He asked about my daily routine, my hobbies, and my medical history. The whole process felt almost ordinary. And strangely enough, as the minutes passed, my nervousness faded, because the questions were things I could answer easily. At one point, Dr. Reynolds smiled. "You seem quite sharp, Mrs. Wilson." I chuckled. "I've been told that before." After about 45 minutes, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "Well," he said, "I'm not seeing any signs of cognitive impairment." Relief flooded through me. "That's good to hear. In fact," he continued, "your results are well within the normal range for someone your age." I felt my shoulders relax for the first time that morning. "Thank you," I said sincerely. Dr. Reynolds nodded. "I'll write up the report this afternoon. You can request a copy if you'd like." I would appreciate that. When we walked back into the waiting area, Emily stood up immediately. "How did it go?" she asked. Dr. Reynolds answered before I could. "Mrs. Wilson performed very well," he said calmly. "Her cognitive function appears normal." Emily's smile froze. For a split second, her expression looked almost stunned. "Oh," she said. Michael looked relieved. "That's great news." "Yes," Dr. Reynolds said politely. "There's no indication that Mrs. Wilson is unable to manage her affairs." I watched Emily carefully. She recovered quickly, forcing a polite smile. "Well, that's wonderful," she said, but something about her tone felt tight, controlled, as if the outcome hadn't matched what she had expected. Michael placed a hand on my shoulder. "See, Mom, nothing to worry about." We left the clinic together. Outside, the air was warm and bright, the kind of early summer day that usually lifts my spirits. But as we stood in the parking lot, Emily spoke again. "Well," she said slowly, "it's still good to check these things." "Of course," I replied. "Doctors don't always catch everything in one visit," she added casually. The comment lingered in the air. Michael frowned slightly. "Emily, I'm just saying," she continued quickly, "that it's important to keep monitoring things." I didn't respond. Instead, I watched her closely. Because for the first time since this whole situation began, something about Emily had shifted. Until now, she had seemed confident, certain, but today, for the briefest moment, I had seen something else. Frustration. Her plan, whatever it truly was, had not moved forward the way she expected. But that didn't mean she would stop trying. And as I drove home later that afternoon, one thought stayed firmly in my mind. If Emily had been counting on that doctor's report, then today had just forced her to rethink her next move. And people who are determined enough often become even more dangerous when their first plan fails. For the next few days after the evaluation, things were unusually quiet. Emily didn't call. Michael didn't mention the paperwork again. Even Lucas seemed more relaxed during his next visit. On the surface, it almost felt like the situation had resolved itself. The doctor had confirmed what I already knew, that my mind was perfectly clear. Emily's concerns had been disproven. The tension should have faded. But something inside me told me not to believe that calm. People who spend weeks preparing a plan rarely abandon it after the first obstacle. David Carter thought the same. When I met him 2 days after the appointment, he listened carefully as I described what happened at the clinic. "And the doctor confirmed everything was normal?" he asked. "Yes." "That's excellent." I nodded, but my uneasiness must have shown on my face. "You don't look relieved," he observed. "I'm not sure I am," I admitted. David leaned back in his chair. "Tell me why." "Because Emily didn't react the way I expected." "How so?" "She seemed disappointed." David nodded slowly. "That's important." "Why?" "Because it suggests the evaluation mattered to her more than she admitted." I thought about the brief flicker of frustration I had seen on Emily's face in the clinic parking lot. "She expected a different outcome," I said quietly. "Possibly." "And now that she didn't get it," David's voice remained calm, "she may look for another path." The words sent a quiet chill through me. "What kind of path?" In many guardianship situations, David explained if the medical route fails, the person pursuing control may attempt to create other evidence. Evidence of what? Unsafe behavior. I frowned. "What do you mean?" "Examples that suggest you are no longer capable of managing daily life." "How would someone do that?" David gave a small, careful shrug. Sometimes by exaggerating normal mistakes, sometimes by misrepresenting events, sometimes by creating situations where the person appears confused or incapable. The thought unsettled me deeply. You think Emily might try to stage something like that? I don't know, David said, but it's wise to be cautious. That evening, I returned home feeling more alert than ever. David's warning lingered in my mind. If Emily's first plan had failed, she might try something else, something more subtle, something harder to prove. 3 days later, that possibility began to feel very real. It happened on a Thursday afternoon. I had just returned from the grocery store and was carrying 2 bags into the kitchen when the doorbell rang. When I opened the door, Emily stood on the porch. "Donna," she said brightly. "I was just in the neighborhood." Her smile was wide and friendly. Too friendly. "Come in," I said. She stepped inside, glancing briefly around the living room. "You look busy," she said. "I just got back from the store." "Oh, good," she replied. "You're still driving yourself around then." The comment was casual, but it made my attention sharpen immediately. "Yes," I said calmly. "I enjoy it." Emily nodded. "That's good." She walked into the kitchen and leaned lightly against the counter. "I was actually hoping we could talk." "About what?" "The paperwork." "Of course. I've been reviewing it," I said. "And it's very comprehensive." Emily smiled slightly. "That's the idea." There was a short silence between us. Then she said something unexpected. "Michael and I are just trying to make sure everything is organized for the future." "The future?" "Yes," she replied. "You never know when someone might need help managing things." "I understand that," I said carefully. "But the documents give you a lot of control." Emily didn't deny it. "Well," she said lightly, "someone has to take responsibility eventually." The way she said the word asterisk, eventually, asterisk, made something inside me tighten. She believed this would happen. Sooner or later, I decided to push a little further. "Emily," I said calmly, "why are you so concerned about managing my finances?" She blinked, clearly surprised by the question. "Concerned?" "Yes." She gave a small laugh. "I'm not concerned about your finances, Donna." "Then what are you concerned about?" "Your well-being," she replied smoothly. I watched her face carefully. The same polished calm, the same careful words. But now that I knew what to look for, I could see something underneath it. Calculation. "You've been talking to Michael about my memory," I said. Her eyes flickered slightly. "I only mentioned a few small concerns." "Like what?" "Like the time you forgot where you parked at the grocery store." "That never happened." Emily shrugged. "That's how I remember it." The calm certainty in her voice was unsettling, because she wasn't arguing. She was simply stating her version of events. A version that, if repeated often enough, might begin to sound true. "You also told him I get confused at night," I added. "I said you sometimes seem tired," she replied. Another carefully chosen word. I suddenly understood something important. Emily wasn't making obvious accusations. She was planning impressions. Impressions that could later become testimony. Just like David warned. "Well," she said after a moment, "none of this is urgent." She tapped the folder on the table. "But eventually these decisions will have to be made." I met her eyes. "Eventually by whom?" Her smile returned. "By the family." The way she said it made it sound reasonable, almost loving. But the implication beneath those words was clear. Emily believed she would be the one making those decisions, and she believed it was only a matter of time. She stayed for another 15 minutes, chatting about ordinary things, as if the conversation hadn't carried any deeper meaning. Then she stood up and picked up her purse. "Think about the paperwork," she said. "I will," I replied. After she left, I sat down at the kitchen table and opened my notebook again. I carefully wrote down everything that had just happened. Every word, every phrase, every implication. Because the more I listened to Emily, the clearer one thing became. She wasn't finished, not even close. And if she couldn't convince a doctor that I was incapable, then she might try to convince everyone else instead. After Emily left that afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table longer than usual. The notebook lay open in front of me, my pen resting beside it. I had already written down everything I could remember from our conversation, every word she chose, carefully every implication hidden beneath those polite sentences. But as I stared at the page, one thought kept repeating itself in my mind. Emily wasn't panicking. If anything, she seemed even more confident than before. That bothered me, because people whose plans have failed usually show frustration or retreat or try something dramatically different. Emily hadn't done any of those things. She had simply continued, as if the outcome at the doctor's office hadn't changed anything at all. That night, I called David Carter again. When I finished describing the conversation, he was quiet for several seconds. "Something about this doesn't add up," I said. "You're right," he replied. "What do you mean?" If Emily truly believed the doctor's evaluation mattered, he explained she would likely be more concerned about the results. But she isn't. No. Which means, David spoke slowly, it may mean she never intended for that evaluation to be the decisive factor. The possibility made my stomach tighten. Then why push for it at all? There are a few reasons, he said. One possibility is that she hoped the evaluation would support her concerns. And the other, she may simply be building a record that she encouraged medical evaluation. For what purpose? For a future claim that she was acting responsibly. The logic was unsettling. Every step Emily took could be framed as concern. Concern about my health, concern about my safety, concern about my future. But beneath that concern was something else entirely. Control. 2 days later, another unexpected development happened. It was late afternoon when my phone rang. "Michael." "Hi, Mom," he said. "Hi, sweetheart." His voice sounded tired. "How are you doing?" he asked. "I'm fine." There was a pause. "Emily told me you two talked the other day." "Yes." "About the paperwork." "That's right." Michael hesitated. "Mom, you know we're only trying to help." His words were gentle, but they carried the same tone Emily used. Carefully framed concern. "I understand that," I said. "Then why are you so hesitant?" I took a slow breath. "Because the documents give Emily a lot of authority." Michael sighed. "Well, someone has to take care of things eventually." The exact same phrase Emily had used. Eventually. It was as if they had rehearsed the argument together. "Michael," I said quietly, "do you really think I can't manage my own life?" There was a long silence on the line. I didn't say that he replied. "But do you think it—" Another silence. "I just think it's smart to prepare for the future." His answer wasn't an accusation, but it wasn't reassurance either. When the call ended, I sat staring at the phone for a long time, because for the first time, I realized something deeply painful. Michael might not fully understand what Emily was doing, but he was still supporting her version of events. Not because he wanted to hurt me, but because it was easier than questioning his wife. Later that evening, Lucas called. Or rather, Michael handed him the phone. Grandma Lucas said cheerfully. "Hi, sweetheart." We talked for a few minutes about school and his latest science project. Then his voice dropped slightly. "Grandma." "Yes." "Mom was talking about your house again." My heart tightened. What did she say this time? Lucas thought for a moment. "She said if things work out, it could solve a lot of problems." "What kind of problems?" "I don't know." "Was she talking to Dad?" "No, she was on the phone." "With who?" "I think someone from a real estate place." "A real estate place?" The words echoed in my mind. "Did you hear anything else?" Lucas hesitated. "She said the house is worth way more now than when you bought it." That much was true. Columbus property values had risen steadily for years. But then she said something weird, Lucas added. "What was that?" She said once everything is finalized, they'll finally be able to breathe again. Finally be able to breathe again. Debt. Karen's earlier conversation came rushing back into my thoughts. If Emily was under serious financial pressure, then my house could represent an easy solution. A large asset. One that could suddenly become available if she gained legal authority over my finances. After Lucas hung up, I immediately called David again. When I told him what Lucas had overheard, his tone grew more serious. "That confirms something important," he said. "What?" "Your daughter-in-law may already be planning what to do with your property. Before she even has legal control." "Yes." "Is that unusual?" "Not at all," David replied. "In fact, it often means the person pursuing control feels confident they will eventually succeed." The thought made my chest tighten. "She thinks it's inevitable." "Possibly. And if that's true..." David paused before answering. "Then she may escalate." "Escalate how..." "If persuasion doesn't work," he said carefully, "people sometimes try to force a situation." "What do you mean by force?" "Creating circumstances where others believe you cannot safely live alone." My mind immediately went back to the examples he had mentioned earlier. Misrepresented events, unsafe situations, confusion, accidents. "David," I said quietly, "what if she tries something like that?" "That's why we're documenting everything," he replied. "But there's something else you should start doing." "What?" "Be very careful about being alone with her." The suggestion made my heart skip. "You think she could actually stage something?" "I don't know," he said honestly. "But if someone is determined enough to gain control of valuable assets..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. After the call ended, I walked slowly through my house again, past the living room, past the photographs on the hallway wall, past the staircase Robert had built himself 35 years ago. Every part of this home carried memories, not just of my life, but of my family's life. And now somewhere within that family, someone was quietly planning how to take it. But the one thing Emily didn't know yet was this. I wasn't the helpless old woman she thought I was. And if she truly intended to push this situation further, she was going to discover that I was far more prepared than she expected. The next 2 weeks passed with an uneasy calm. Emily didn't come by again. Michael called occasionally, but our conversations stayed carefully on safe topics. Lucas's school, the weather, his job. Neither of us mentioned the paperwork anymore. But the silence didn't feel like peace. It felt like something gathering strength behind closed doors. I continued writing in my notebook every day. Even the smallest details went into it: phone calls, visits, comments about my memory conversations Lucas overheard. At first, documenting everything had felt strange. Now it gave me a sense of control. Control Emily thought she was taking away from me. One Saturday afternoon, Michael called and asked if he and Lucas could stop by. Of course, I said. When they arrived, I immediately noticed something unusual. Emily wasn't with them. Michael looked tired, more tired than I had seen him in a long time. His shoulders were tense, and there were dark circles under his eyes. Lucas ran straight into the living room to grab his favorite board game. Michael lingered near the doorway. "Mom," he said quietly. "Yes." "Can we talk for a minute?" The tone of his voice made my heart beat a little faster. "Of course." We stepped into the kitchen while Lucas started setting up the game in the living room. Michael rubbed the back of his neck the way he used to when he was nervous as a teenager. "What's on your mind?" I asked. He hesitated. "Emily's been stressed lately." I waited. "She's dealing with some financial stuff." There it was. The confirmation I had been expecting. "What kind of financial stuff?" I asked carefully. Michael sighed. "Credit cards, some investments that didn't work out." "How serious is it?" He hesitated again. "Pretty serious." I kept my voice calm. "Does it have anything to do with my house?" Michael looked up sharply. "Why would you ask that?" Because Emily had been talking to real estate agents. Because Lucas had overheard her phone calls. Because the entire situation suddenly made sense. But I didn't say any of that. Instead, I simply said, "It's just a question." Michael stared at the floor for a moment. Then he said something that hurt more than I expected. "Emily thinks the house is an asset that could help the whole family." The words hung heavily in the air. An asset. Not a home. Not the place where he grew up. Just a financial solution. "And what do you think?" I asked quietly. Michael looked uncomfortable. "I think she's under a lot of pressure." "That's not what I asked." He sighed again. "I don't want anyone getting hurt." I nodded slowly. "Neither do I." But someone already had. Lucas suddenly appeared in the doorway. "Are you guys coming?" Michael forced a small smile. "Yeah, buddy, we're coming." We spent the next hour playing a board game in the living room. Lucas laughed when I beat him by 2 spaces. Michael tried to act relaxed, but I could see his mind was somewhere else entirely. Eventually, Lucas went upstairs to look for an old puzzle he liked. The moment he was out of earshot, Michael spoke again. "Mom, Emily thinks you might be vulnerable living here alone." The phrase sounded painfully familiar. Vulnerable, how I asked. "She worries about accidents or someone taking advantage of you." The irony almost made me laugh. "I've lived in this house for 40 years, I said. "I know. But Emily thinks." "I know what Emily thinks," I interrupted gently. Michael fell silent. Then he said something that revealed more than he probably intended. "She's worried you might not remember things clearly." The same narrative again. Memory. Confusion. Concern. "Michael," I said softly, "have you personally seen me forget anything important?" He didn't answer right away. Finally, he shook his head. "No. But you still think I need someone managing my life. I just think we should be prepared." Prepared. Another carefully chosen word. The truth was becoming painfully clear. Michael didn't fully believe Emily's story, but he wasn't strong enough to challenge it either. He was caught between loyalty to his wife and loyalty to his mother, and instead of confronting the conflict, he was quietly allowing Emily's version of events to continue. Lucas came back downstairs a few minutes later carrying the puzzle box. Found it. The tension in the room dissolved instantly. We finished the game, and not long after that, Michael and Lucas left. But something important had shifted during that conversation. For the first time, Michael had admitted the financial pressure Emily was under. For the first time, he had acknowledged that my house had become part of their discussions. Later that evening, I called David Carter and told him everything. When I finished, he spoke very carefully. This confirms the motive we suspected. The debt. Yes. And the house. Yes. What happens next? I asked. David's voice remained calm. If Emily believes gaining control of your finances will solve her problems, she may become more aggressive. More aggressive how? More attempts to establish that you cannot live independently. His words sent a chill through me. But we're ready for that, he continued. How? You have documentation. You have a medical evaluation confirming your competence. And you have legal representation. I exhaled slowly. But there's something else, David added. What? The longer Emily continues pushing this narrative despite evidence that you are capable, the worse it looks for her. Exactly. That realization gave me a small sense of reassurance. For weeks I had felt like I was on the defensive. Now I realized something important. Emily wasn't just creating risk for me. She was creating risk for herself. Because if her efforts to gain control became too obvious, they could eventually be seen for what they really were. Manipulation, financial exploitation. And the more determined she became, the more likely she was to make a mistake. As I hung up the phone that night, I walked through my house once again. The same familiar rooms, the same photographs, the same quiet history of my family. Emily might see this house as an asset, but to me it was something far more valuable. And I wasn't going to let anyone take it away. Not through lies, not through pressure, and certainly not through manipulation. Because if Emily thought this story would end with me quietly handing over control, she was about to discover just how wrong she was. By the time autumn began creeping into Columbus, the tension that had been building quietly for months finally started to crack. Leaves had begun turning red and gold along the sidewalks of my neighborhood, and the air carried that crisp coolness that always reminded me of the years when Michael was a little boy running through piles of fallen leaves in our backyard. Those memories felt distant now, because the situation with Emily was reaching a breaking point. 2 days after my conversation with David Carter about Michael's admission of their financial troubles, something happened that none of us had expected. Michael showed up at my house alone. It was nearly 7 in the evening when I heard a knock at the door. When I opened it, he stood there looking exhausted, not just tired, defeated. "Mom," he said quietly. "Michael, is everything all right?" He shook his head. "Can I come in?" "Of course." He stepped inside, slowly glancing around the living room as if seeing the house differently than before. I could almost imagine the memories moving through his mind the way they moved through mine. Birthday parties, Christmas mornings, late-night homework sessions at the kitchen table. Michael sat down on the couch and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. For a moment, he didn't speak. Then he said something that immediately made my heart tighten. "I found the emails." "Emails?" I asked carefully. He nodded. "Emily's." A quiet wave of dread moved through me. "What kind of emails?" Michael ran a hand through his hair. "The ones she's been sending for the past few months?" "To who?" "Real estate agents, financial advisors, and—" He paused, swallowing hard. "A long-term care facility." The words landed heavily in the quiet room. "What did they say?" I asked gently. Michael looked up at me with a mixture of anger and shame. "She's been asking about the value of this house." I already knew that part. But hearing Michael say it still hurt. And I asked. She was asking how quickly a property like this could be sold once legal authority was established. My chest tightened painfully. "Legal authority," I repeated. Michael nodded slowly, and she mentioned the guardianship documents. The room fell silent. "How did you find these emails?" I asked. Michael exhaled slowly. "Because the credit card companies started calling. That confirmed what Karen had told me weeks earlier." "The debt?" I asked. "It's worse than I thought," he admitted. "How bad?" He stared down at the floor. "More than $80,000. The number hung in the air like a heavy weight. "Credit cards," he continued. "Personal loans. Some investment she tried that completely failed." "And she didn't tell you?" Michael shook his head. "She kept saying everything was under control." The pain in his voice was obvious. "And when did you realize she planned to use my house?" I asked. He hesitated. "Yesterday." "What happened yesterday?" "I saw the emails she sent to the care facility." My stomach tightened again. What did they say? Michael swallowed. She was asking about the process of admitting someone whose family believed they could no longer live independently. The exact scenario David had warned me about. "And she mentioned you," he added quietly. "How?" She said her husband's mother had been showing signs of memory decline. I closed my eyes briefly. Even though I had suspected it for weeks, hearing it confirmed still felt like a knife twisting in my chest. Michael looked devastated. I didn't know she was saying things like that. "I believe you," I said softly. "Mom, I'm so sorry." His voice cracked slightly. I should have seen it sooner. I sat down across from him. "Michael," I said gently, "did you ever truly believe I was losing my memory?" He shook his head immediately. "No." "Then why didn't you stop her?" The question wasn't angry, just honest. Michael rubbed his face with both hands. "Because I didn't want to believe she would go that far." The answer hurt, but it also made sense. Sometimes denial feels easier than confrontation. "What are you going to do now?" I asked. Michael sat quietly for several seconds before answering. I told her I'm done. The words were quiet but firm. "She left the apartment this afternoon." I blinked. "You mean?" "We're separating." The finality in his voice made my chest tighten again, but this time for a different reason. The situation had crossed the point of quiet tension. Now it was unraveling completely. "And Lucas?" I asked. "He's with my sister tonight," Michael said. "He doesn't know everything yet." I nodded slowly. "That's probably for the best." Michael leaned back against the couch. I confronted her about the emails, he continued. "What did she say?" At first she denied everything. "Of course. But when I showed her the messages, she got angry." Michael's expression darkened. "She said we were drowning in debt and no one else was going to save us." My heart sank. And then she said something I'll never forget. "What was that?" Michael looked up at me. "She said your house was sitting there doing nothing while our lives were falling apart." The words were so cold they almost didn't feel real, as if the place where Michael had grown up meant nothing more than a financial calculation. And then I asked. She said eventually you would need help anyway. That same word again. Eventually. "But she didn't expect you to fight back," he added. I looked at him carefully. "She thought I would sign those papers." Michael nodded slowly. "She thought everyone would believe her." A long silence filled the room. Finally, Michael spoke again. "Mom, David Carter called me today." That surprised me. "He did?" "Yes." "What did he say?" "He said if Emily continues trying to gain control of your finances through false claims." Michael paused. "She could face serious legal consequences." That was the first time I had heard David phrase it that strongly. "And that scared her," Michael continued. "She packed a bag and left." For several minutes, neither of us spoke. The quiet between us carried years of shared history and recent months of painful confusion. Finally, Michael said something that made my throat tighten. "Lucas was the one who told me." "What do you mean?" "He said he warned you not to sign." A small smile touched my face. "He did." Michael shook his head slowly. "I guess my 8-year-old son saw the truth before I did." Children often do. That night after Michael left, I walked slowly through the house again. The same rooms, the same photographs, but something felt different now. The storm that had been building for months had finally broken. Emily's plan had collapsed, not because of lawyers, not because of legal documents, but because a little boy had spoken 6 simple words that changed everything. And because the truth, no matter how carefully someone tries to hide it, eventually finds a way to come out. In the weeks that followed Emily's departure, life slowly began to settle into a new rhythm. Not the same rhythm as before. Some things once broken never return exactly the way they were, but a quieter, more honest one. The first real change came from Michael. For the first time in months, his visits to my house felt natural again. He stopped arriving with careful questions about my memory. He stopped mentioning paperwork or planning for the future. Instead, he came by simply to sit at the kitchen table and talk the way we used to. One evening, about 3 weeks after he told me about the emails, he brought Lucas over for dinner. Lucas ran straight into the living room and dropped his backpack by the couch. "Grandma, I got an A on my science project," he announced proudly. "That's wonderful," I said, hugging him. Michael smiled from the doorway, but there was still a heaviness behind his eyes. After Lucas went outside to kick a soccer ball in the backyard, Michael and I sat down together at the kitchen table. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then he finally said the words I think he had been carrying for weeks. "I should have protected you." I looked at him quietly. "You didn't know everything." "But I knew enough," he replied. His voice was steady, but the regret in it was obvious. I saw the signs, he continued. I just didn't want to believe what they meant. That kind of honesty is painful to hear, but it's also the only place real healing can begin. "I understand," I said softly. Michael shook his head. "No, Mom, you trusted me, and I let someone convince me that you might not be capable of taking care of yourself." I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. You didn't convince yourself of that, I said, gently. You were trying to hold your marriage together. He looked down at our hands for a long moment. Emily and I are filing for divorce next month, he said quietly. The finality in his voice told me the decision had already settled in his mind. And Lucas, I asked. I'm keeping the apartment, he said. He'll stay with me. I nodded. Do you think that's the right choice? Michael exhaled slowly. I think it's the only choice. Over the next several weeks, the legal situation surrounding Emily unfolded quickly. David Carter helped me formally revoke any documents that Emily had attempted to prepare in my name. He also filed a notice ensuring that no one could pursue guardianship claims without my legal representation being present. The medical report from Dr. Reynolds was added to my records as further confirmation that I was fully capable of managing my own life. David also advised me to update my estate planning documents. This time I made several important decisions. First, I appointed a neutral professional trustee for certain financial matters instead of a family member. Second, I created clear legal protections preventing anyone from selling my home without my direct consent. And third, I established a trust that would eventually benefit Lucas. When I told Michael about that last decision, he looked both grateful and humbled. You don't have to do that, he said. I want to, I replied. Lucas did something very important. Michael smiled slightly. He told me the whole story. What part? The part where he grabbed your arm and whispered not to sign. I laughed softly. He was very serious about it. Michael shook his head in amazement. I still can't believe an 8-year-old figured out what was happening before I did. Children notice more than we think, I said. They just don't always have the words to explain it. Autumn slowly turned into winter. The leaves disappeared from the trees and cold winds began moving through the streets of Columbus. But inside my house, things felt lighter than they had in months. Lucas continued visiting every weekend. Sometimes we baked cookies. Sometimes we worked on his school projects. Sometimes we just sat in the living room watching old movies. One afternoon in early December, we were decorating the Christmas tree together. Lucas carefully hung a small wooden ornament Robert had carved years ago. Grandma, he said. Yes. Are you still scared? The question surprised me. Scared of what I asked? Of Mom trying to take your house. I looked at the twinkling lights on the tree for a moment before answering. I was scared for a while, I admitted. Lucas frowned slightly. But not anymore. I smiled. No. Why not? Because something had changed. Not just in my family, but in myself. I realized something important, I said. What? That sometimes people try to take control of things that don't belong to them. Lucas nodded thoughtfully. But the truth has a way of coming out, I continued. And when it does, the people who tried to hide it usually end up revealing themselves. Lucas considered that for a moment. Then he asked the question that brought the entire story back to where it started. Grandma, do you remember what I said to you that day? I smiled warmly. Oh, I remember. He grinned. 6 words. That's right. Lucas tilted his head proudly. I saved you. Yes, I said softly. You did. And the truth was, he really had. Not with strength, not with legal knowledge, not with complicated plans, just with honesty. Sometimes that's all it takes to stop something dangerous before it grows too powerful. 6 simple words. Grandma, Mom set you up. Don't sign. Those 6 words had given me the chance to see the truth before it was too late. And because of that, I was still sitting in the same house Robert and I had built our life in, still living on my own terms, and most importantly, still surrounded by the people who truly cared about me. Family is supposed to be the place where we feel safest. It's where trust is built, where love is supposed to protect us, and where we believe people will always act in our best interest. But sometimes even inside families, things become complicated. Pressure, debt, fear, and desperation can push people into choices they might never have imagined making before. In those moments, the line between concern and control can become dangerously blurred. One of the most important lessons I learned through this experience is that age should never mean losing your voice. Growing older doesn't mean becoming invisible. It doesn't mean giving up the right to make your own decisions. And it certainly doesn't mean someone else should quietly take control of your life. Another lesson is that manipulation often starts small. It begins with tiny suggestions, small comments, subtle doubts planted in conversations. Over time, those little seeds can grow into a story that people start to believe even when it isn't true. That's why awareness matters. And that's why speaking up matters. Sometimes the person who tells the truth first isn't a lawyer, a judge, or even an adult. Sometimes it's a child who simply says what they see. Lucas didn't understand legal documents or financial motives. He just knew something felt wrong, and he was brave enough to say it. If you were in my situation, what would you have done? Would you have trusted your instincts? Would you have questioned the people around you? I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I read as many comments as I can, and your perspectives are always interesting to see. And if stories like this remind you how important family honesty and courage really are, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel so you don't miss future stories. Sometimes the most powerful truths come from the simplest words. And sometimes those words can change everything.